Mr. Damon Fordham.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Whipper, being that you and your family are very familiar with the spirituals of our tradition, you might recognize that as Deep River, Lord. My home is over Jordan. Deep River, Lord. I've got to cross over into campground. Now, during slavery, when they would sing songs like that, the slave master would say, "Oh, what a wonderful song about going to the river and getting baptized." No. That songs like that were code for wanting to get off of the plantations and out of there and into freedom. But since they couldn't openly say it like that, they had to disguise it using terms such as that to make it sound what it wasn't. So they had to use their intelligence to sing these things in code, to whereas those who were within the culture knew what it was all about. And that goes to show you that just because many of these individuals were denied the right to get an education, learn to read and such, because as Frederick Douglass himself expertly put it, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave, a subject that I'm going to return to a little bit later in our lecture. And so therefore, they had to basically do what they can with what they had in order to get from point A to point B. So let us take our story back a little bit within the hour I have allotted to you today. In the West African coast, there were several great kingdoms: the Songhai, the Ghana, and the Mali. The Songhai was the last one, and it was run by a great king by the name of Askia Muhammad. And Askia Muhammad had about as much land from the tip of West Africa, where Africa sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean, modern-day Senegal, going down into Chad and Niger and that middle section of Africa, right? So things were going great. They had a pretty advanced kingdom. But as Sir Isaac Newton says in the law of gravity, what goes up must come down. And so in 1528, the old king went blind. And you know, my mother used to often say that smart parents have lazy children. Well, that was true in this case. Because Askia Muhammad had these three lazy, worthless, and trifling sons who were greedy for the throne for themselves. So they exiled their father out to a nearby island. And for the next some 40, 50 years, they fought over the throne. Now there's another saying that the old folks have: God don't like ugly. And further up north in Africa, in Morocco, in the Arabic part of Africa, you had a Sultan al-Mansur who looked at what was happening down in the Songhai kingdom. And he figured out that the Songhai people had something that he didn't have, which was gold. But he had something that they didn't have: guns, that he got from Spain. And so you can kind of see what happens next. They took over the Songhai kingdom and they imprisoned its scholars and wise people. And some of them were killed. Why? Because as an old adage goes, you cut off the head and the body will die. And it was around this same time period that after Columbus came to the shores of North America in the late 1400s and early 1500s, on his third voyage, he had with him a Spanish priest. His name was Father Bartolomé de Casas. And Father Bartolomé was horrified by Columbus's treatment of the natives of the region. So he said, "This is a sin against God. We got to do something to save the condition of these poor Native Americans here. His solution, go to Africa and use the blacks instead. Well, by 1527, he said, quote, that had he known what would have happened to the African had he done that, he would have not have done so, that he acted out of ignorance, and he begged God to forgive him. That was in a book he wrote called The History de la West Indies, Historia de la West Indies, the history of the West Indies. And so those factors led to the transcontinental slave trade. Now, I was in a couple of the major slave ports of West Africa. I was in Gorée Island, which is in Senegal, which is in the upper northwestern part of Africa, where they had the door of no return, where they marched them through on the slave ships. And the largest and the oldest of these was down in Ghana, a place called Elmina Castle, which is Portuguese for the mines. And what they had in the Elmina Castle was so diabolical that years later I had a good friend by the name of Mr. Joseph Engels. Some of you might have known him. He was a survivor of the Auschwitz death camps in Europe during World War II, okay? Now, when I was at Elmina Castle, they showed us a dungeon that had a skull and crossbones over it, and they said that that was where they would take the Africans who rebelled and would lock them up for 3 days. Why 3 days? Because the human body can go for 3 days without food, but 3 days without water? So at the end of the 3rd day, they would get all the other Africans who were in the pens and cages at gunpoint to watch while they would drag the bodies of those who they incarcerated into that dungeon with the skull and crossbones as a way of saying, try this and this will happen to you. Now, when I used to sit with Mr. Joseph Engel and he would tell me stories about what they did to him and other Jewish people at Auschwitz and all that during the Second World War, I have a feeling that they must have studied what happened over at Elmina Castle because of how devious and diabolical a lot of this was. So here's how we come in. In 1526, you had the Spanish coming to North America. And one such person was a man by the name of Juan Luis Vasquez de Ayllón. He landed in what we now call Georgetown, South Carolina, around 1526, with a boatload of Spanish conquerors and African slaves. And he named the area as the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe. However, the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe was short-lived because Captain Vasquez died early in the voyage and left behind a corrupt administrator named Gines Doncel. And Gines Doncel was so corrupt that one night the Africans surrounded his hut and set it on fire with the desired results. Well, the Africans then ran into the interior, where they married in with the Waccamaw Native American tribe. And their descendants are among the black people of Georgetown, South Carolina, and that county today. So the surviving Spaniards, seeing that, this isn't going to work, they sailed back to Spain and filed a report with King Ferdinand, which can today be found in a book called Yes, Lord, I Know the Road by J. Brent Morris, which is my source for that portion of our story. So, in 1663, King Charles II of England colonized this area. And being the humble, modest, and unassuming guy that he was, he named this place Charlestown. Okay? Humble guy, you see. So therefore, in 1670, Captain Nathaniel sailed from England on a boat called the Three Brothers with a boatload of English settlers. And on the way here, he stopped in Barbados, where he purchased a family of 3 Africans, who he gave the English names of John, John Jr., and Elizabeth. Needless to say, we don't know their African names. So they sailed on these shores in the summer of 1670 with over at what we now know as Charlestown Landing, and that is the foundation of slavery, settlement, and colonization here in the Charleston area. So, some of you might know this. Now, some of you might know that as Michael rowed the boat ashore, hallelujah. Michael rowed the boat ashore, hallelujah, right? Well, that song, along with the sweetgrass baskets that you see in this region, and the foodways and the folkways and the dialect and the culture of much of the black population in this area, those things are collectively known as the Gullah culture, sometimes called Geechee. And the name of that comes from the Gola tribe of Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa, which I could tell you firsthand have a long history of growing and cultivating rice. In fact, I have a sweetgrass basket at home that was from Sierra Leone that's exactly like what you see here. So, those folks over there had this long history of growing and cultivating rice and making these baskets. And they were brought to these shores from between Georgetown, South Carolina, and Brunswick, Georgia, for the rice plantations. And these rice plantations on these sea islands were so isolated that the only white people there were the plantation owners and overseers. And with so few white people, these black people kept more of their African speech, folkways, and culture than any other black people brought to these United States. And this is where we get the Gullah culture. My grandmother, Janie Fordham, was born in Omendaw, South Carolina. Yes, your hometown. Around 1900. And she had to work in the fields as a little girl. So she never had the opportunity to go to school to learn to read and write. And so she spoke Gullah till the day she died in 1976 when I was 12 years old. So in 1968, when I was 4 years old, yeah, do the math, she would call me in the house by going, "Damon, y'all churn too trifling. Y'all better come on in here before I box y'all," and things like that. Sound familiar, Tanya? Okay. So she and my grandfather saved their money so that my dad could go to South Carolina State University, and he became the first of 3 generations of teachers in our family. I am the second, and my nephew is the third. And in those days, when you were in an educated family in this area, your parents did not want you speaking Gullah because people looked down on this as country, ignorant, backward, and low class. But as you could tell, I always had a knack for theatrics. So every now and then, I would deliberately make Dad furious and go, "Daddy, I'm hungry. I just want some okra soup." "Stop that. I didn't send you to school to talk like that." "I went wrong, Daddy. I just want something for eat." "Stop it. Quit mocking the grandmother. Stop it," I said. Well, in 1932, there was Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a black professor of linguistics at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And he came down to South Carolina State to teach in the summer of 1932 and was shocked when he heard the students of this area say things like, "Man, Dr. Turner, you hot up in ya, man, up the window." Excuse me? "Man, Dr. Turner, hot up in ya, up the window? Why, what type of speech is this? I find this fascinating. This I must study." So he went throughout coastal South Carolina and Georgia studying Gullah. And he met a lady in Harris Neck, Georgia, outside of Brunswick, by the name of Amelia Darley. And as the two of them were conversing, she began to sing this song that went something like, "Awaka yileke yile 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 hiwaka yilene yi." "Madam, what is that you are singing?" Oh, my great-grandma used to sing that when I was a little gal. Let me see if I understand you correctly. Your great-grandmother used to sing that when you were a little girl. Madam, I must ask you this. Did your great-grandmother come directly off the boat from Africa? Yeah, how you didn't know that? Why, Eureka! That is the funeral song of the Mende tribe of Sierra Leone. This gullah is not the ignorant, backward country junk that people think it is. There's the cultural connection between the blacks of America and those of Africa. And so in 1949, he wrote Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. And in 1988, General Joseph Mumu of Sierra Leone spoke at the Penn Center, 70 miles south of us in St. Helena's Island. And he got up in front of the people and said in his native tongue, I'm glad to see you today. And a lady in the audience who spoke Gullah replied, Brave goddamn man for talk like we. He sounds like us. So the man who was Bloody Fasidum took the people who talk like we back to Sierra Leone, and the people on both sides were amazed at the similarities of languages, lifestyles, and culture, that PBS went along with them and filmed a documentary called Family Across the Sea, and that is the story of Gullah. Now, the song Michael Row the Boat Ashore has some additional historical significance. You see, in 1867, musicologists went down to Port Royal, South Carolina, down by Beaufort, and they heard black people singing that song, and a man by the name of Charles Lane wrote it down in musical notation and put it in the book Slave Songs of the United States. Well, here in Charleston in 1955, there was a great teacher who I had met twice when I was a boy and who would later work with Martin Luther King. Her name was Miss Septima Poinsett Clark, and she was fired from teaching at Sanders Clyde Elementary because of her civil rights activities. So she went to Monteagle, Tennessee, where she taught illiterate black adults how to read and write and register to vote and take charge of their lives. So about 1959, she was joined by some white kids from the University of Berkeley in California, where I lectured in 2013, and the coffee houses of Greenwich Village and New York. And they were all arrested. And Miss Clark was put in a separate cell from the white kids for obvious reasons. So Miss Clark began to sing Michael Row the Boat Ashore, and the white kids never heard anything like this before. So when they went back to the University of Berkeley and the coffee houses of Greenwich Village, they took that song with them. And this is where you get that generation of the white folk singers, like Pete Seeger and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and the Smothers Brothers, and the Mamas and the Papas, and Jonice Mitchell, and Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. If you could imagine Bob Dylan getting up there and going, Michael Row the Boat Ashore, hallelujah. This is how that song became internationally famous. So in 1981, Ms. Clark sued the state of South Carolina for the unjust lost years of back pay and collected and won. And I got to see her the next year. Now, Tanya, you remember our classmate Veronica Washington, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, well, she and I were at a parade in downtown Charleston in 1982, right after she won the money. And they were having the parade, and Burke High Band and C.A. Brown High School and all of them were marching and doing their dancing in the streets and all of that. And Miss Clark came by in a float for the parade, where apparently she was queen of the parade. She had on a queen crown and holding up a staff and regalia and all of this. And Veronica and I were almost moved to tears by watching the people just go up to just touch the float and say, Miss Clark, Miss Clark, Miss Clark, getting her flowers while she could still smell them before she died on December 15th, 1987. And I saw to it that that story was preserved in my second book called Voices of Black South Carolina. Now, one of the favorite subjects of mine that I like to deal with is the story of Reconstruction, because I like to talk about things that most people don't already know. And the story of Reconstruction was censored from our history books for over 150 years, for reasons I'm going to get into very shortly. The Reconstruction period was that era from 1865 to 1877, when after the fall of the Confederacy and the end of slavery, the federal government tried to reform the South by passing 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th Amendment in 1868 said all persons born here are citizens. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 said all men born here have the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So this led to the fact that during that 12-year period, black men in the South were voting and electing their own representatives, and some 2,000 African-American men were serving as representatives in the Deep South during this period. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 1872, there was a corrupt governor named Henry Warmoth, who they impeached for racketeering and embezzlement, and they replaced him with the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he did such an excellent job as the interim governor that he decided to run for the U.S. Senate from Louisiana in 1873, which would have made him the second black senator after Hiram Revels of Mississippi, who was sworn in 1870, exactly 156 years ago yesterday. Well, even though he won the election, the U.S. Senate refused to seat him. Gee, I wonder why. So he appealed before the Democratic Party to no avail, and he appealed before the Republican Party to no avail. So according to the United States Congressional Record of June 8, 1874, page 432 to 433, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback got up before the body of the United States House of Representatives and said, "I am a man, and I am an American citizen, with all of the rights and the privileges that are due to an American citizen. But I say to you that from this day forward, I shall not follow the dictates of the Democratic Party. I shall not follow the dictates of the Republican Party. From this day forward, I shall only follow the dictates of my heart and of my conscience." And he still didn't get it. However, in 1880, he became the founder of Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, one of the oldest and largest black colleges in America, before he died in 1921. Meanwhile, here in South Carolina, from 1870 to 1877, there were 2 black lieutenant governors, Alonzo Jacob Ransier from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howell Gleaves from 1872 to 1877. Richard Howell Gleaves was lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses. Note how that name sounds, Franklin Jacob Moses. That was the first time in American history that a state had a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. That would not happen again until New York in the early 2000s. So while all this was happening, a revolution took place in Charleston from January to April of 1868 at the federal courthouse over on Meeting and Broad. 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina into the most progressive document in American history up to that time. And you can find that, by the way, at the Charleston County Library and at the State Archives in Columbia. This revolutionary document called for such things as all laws pertaining to racial discrimination would be stricken from the books. Women would be allowed to divorce abusive husbands. As a matter of fact, one of the delegates, William J. Whipper, your great-granduncle, got up and proposed that women should be allowed to vote in South Carolina in 1868, excuse me. But that was considered a little too radical for that time, so they didn't go along with that. But they did go along with the idea that no one should go to jail for debt and that there should be state hospitals and mental institutions. However, the great Robert Smalls, who some of you know, sneaked himself and his family out of slavery aboard a Confederate ship called the Planter in Charleston Harbor and off into freedom. Robert Smalls got up at that convention and said, on January 23rd, 1868, and said, "Resolved All children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first public school law ever passed this far south below the Mason-Dixon line. Now, when I bring up these things, people usually ask me two questions. Number one, why haven't I heard any of this before? And number two, well, what the heck happened? I'll explain them both. Throughout the history of the Deep South, the wealthy class of whites' deepest fear was that the poor whites, in their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation, would find common cause with their black brethren and come together to create a revolution that would overthrow the rule of the wealthy class of whites who exploited them both. So, to prevent that from happening, the wealthy whites indoctrinated the poor whites into the idea that if black people had equality with them, the poor whites would be pushed to the bottom of society. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. So, on December 24th, 1865, at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans gathered to form the Resistance Army Against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You see where that went? That's how the Ku Klux Klan started. So for the next 12 years, the Southland bathed in blood as blacks and whites battled out in the streets. Memphis Massacre 1866, New Orleans Massacre 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre 1872, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre 1876, Ellington, South Carolina Massacre 1876, and November the 8th, 1876, right on Broad Street in downtown Charleston, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of the street. The federal government said, yo, this is too much. We can't handle this mess here. We got to put a stop to this. And they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of February 26, 1877. So one of the many negative things that happened out of that was that Mildred Rutherford and her organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, went on a national crusade to censor things like what I just told you out of the history books and replace it with pro-Confederate history. So much so that in 1978, when I was at the 8th grade at Moultrie Middle School over in right here in Mount Pleasant, the South Carolina history book by Mary Sims Oliphant, Laidlaw Press, 1970, page 280, taught our class, quote, after the Civil War ended, the Negroes lost their heads, so the Ku Klux Klan was formed to bring order and stability back to the South. Fortunately for me, when I was a boy, I was a bookworm, I was a weirdo, I was bad at sports, I was awkward, so I read a lot. And among the things I read was Langston Hughes' Pictorial History of the Negro in America and Eyewitness, the Negro in American History by William Loren Katz. Those books were my vaccination against the ignorance I was taught in the classroom. But other kids weren't that fortunate. And this is one of the reasons I tell kids today, the geek shall inherit the earth. So, in 1890, the governor of Mississippi, James K. Fordham, called the Mississippi legislature together to throw out the Progressive Reconstruction Constitution and replace it with one calling for segregation. Here in South Carolina on September 10, 1895, in the State House in Columbia, our senior senator, Benjamin Tillman, who 2 years earlier sent a black man named John Peterson to a lynch mob in Denmark, South Carolina, he called the South Carolina legislature together to throw out the Progressive Reconstruction Constitution and replace it with one calling for segregation. Here in South, so therefore, 6 brave black leaders, Robert Smalls, who I just discussed, William J. Whipper, your great-great-granduncle, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State University, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. Those 6 brave men risked their lives to go before the South Carolina House of Representatives and argue eloquently against the segregation constitution. William J. Whipper, November 1st, 1895, told that body, "The car of Negro progress is coming, yet you wish to stop it. You might as well make up your mind that you cannot do so. The Negro will rise, crush us as you may. The Negro will rise. We cannot be kept down forever. The Negro will rise, for that is the natural order of things, for we cannot be kept down forever, among other things. Well, after a couple of months of debate, they voted on December 4th, 1895. 2 white representatives, T.E. Dudley from Marlborough County and John Halston Reed from Georgetown, said that this new constitution of segregation was such a gross violation of the 14th and 15th Amendment that it would bring disgrace upon the state. Well, they lost 116-7, and that was what led South Carolina into segregation. But however, those men lost the battle, but in the long term, they would eventually win the war, because the generation who would be inspired by them would go on to do what they could to change those conditions. And in 1901, the last black congressman in Reconstruction, George Henry White, got up before the body on January 29th, 1901, and said that this is the Negro's temporary farewell to Congress, but Phoenix-like, one day we will return and rise again. In 1928, there was the first black congressman since Reconstruction. His name was Oscar DePriest from Chicago. And on February 10th, 1930, George Henry White brought with him to Congress John Roy Lynch of Mississippi and Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State. And he brought them before the body of Congress and said, "Gentlemen, these 2 men served before me during the Reconstruction era. And I brought them here today so that you will know that while I am the only one in Congress right now, I am not the last one left." And the Congress applauded. And by 1947, Judge Justice Waitie's Waring over at the courthouse in downtown Charleston ruled in a case called Elmore versus Rice that the laws preventing black people from voting in South Carolina violated the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. That was what allowed my parents and their generation of black people to vote in South Carolina again. And he said that he ruled as such because it is time that South Carolina put this aside and joined the rest of the United States of America. So, right now, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a time of great confusion in these United States. There's political turmoil, and hardly anybody seems to know what to do about it. And that's where you come in. Right now, as we speak, 54% of American adults cannot read above a 6th grade level. Did you know that? That's according to the U.S. Department of Education survey back in 2022. And right now, so many adults cannot tell fact from fiction on the internet that it is one of the major factors that leads to this confusion in our country right now. Because you see, in the final analysis, a couple of things you gotta know. Number one, when you're dealing with TikTok and things like that, oftentimes it's for entertainment purposes only. And if you go to TikTok for medical advice on things on history and politics and things like that, you might as well go to Stevie Wonder to get driving lessons. You'll be like the blind leading the blind. And it's also important to remember too, when you go on certain sites for things, you gotta remember that the internet can be dynamite in the hands of the ignorant. So what you have to do as young people is this. You come here to become skilled at what you know, at what you want to be skilled at, right? To be experts in your field. What you should do is take the knowledge that you have and you go out there and put a lot of what you know to help make humanity better out there on these sites so that people could see real information from real experts. And through that way, you, ladies and gentlemen, can be the guiding lights of the new dark ages. Thank you.